Semester number one, lesson number 40. Our aim today is how is social Darwinism applied to business competition? And before we get started today, I want you to think about something that you probably haven't thought about in a while. What happened to iPods? And I'm not saying the iPhone, what happened to iPods, the original technology from Apple? Think for a second, why, you know, when it was the greatest thing in the world and what has happened to it since then. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about industrialization, and we're going to talk about laissez-faire capitalism, the concept of free enterprise, and social Darwinism, which connects really to what we were talking about last week about um, competition and whatnot. So a very important term that we need to know is the concept of laissez-faire, and you learned about this last year in global. Laissez-faire is a French word that literally means hands off, and what it means in terms of economics is non-interference by the government. The government does not get involved in the economics of a country, right? Government should not interfere in any way with the economic workings of a nation. And instead, the nation works on a free enterprise system where private individuals make the economic decisions. There is the government, and to some extent they do, but for the most part, the government keeps their hands off of business in this country. And we're going to talk about some ways in which they don't in future lessons. But for the most part, whatever the people want to sell, they can sell as long, obviously within legality, right? But anything they want to sell that they think they can make money on, they can sell, right? There are no limits on that. In the late 1800s, government interference was minimal. There was literally close to no government interference, and we're going to talk about in later PowerPoints why that's a problem. All right. On the right, you have The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. And if you guys remember from last year, Adam Smith was the man who preached capitalism, the idea that, people should be the ones who decide what is produced in the country and the supply and demand and this idea of a free enterprise system where, the government really has no say at all in the economic workings of the country. All right. And entrepreneurs expanded business and earned great wealth during this time in the late 1800s. And the four we're going to talk about in great detail are Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, and Morgan. And we'll talk about them in a future PowerPoint. So basically breaking off of or expanding on what we talked about last week, this idea of social Darwinism. All right. If you guys think back to science and Darwin, right? Darwin had this idea of survival of the fittest, and I believe he used the finches, right? Um, the idea that the strongest members of a species will survive, and they will continue to reproduce using the the stronger characteristics or traits. And another example is the giraffe, right? At some point, there were there were the giraffes with long necks, and there were giraffes with short necks. And as evolution occurred, the giraffes with long necks continued to reproduce, while those with short necks could not get food and died out. All right. And we can apply this same characteristic to business, right? Business is not controlled by the government, right? If business is not controlled by the government, the way in which a weak business is exposed is by failing, right? Weak businesses die out and strong businesses would thrive and get better. Government regulation would interfere with this natural selection process, right? The government stepping in and doing something would prevent this pretty natural process from taking place. And any government programs to aid the poor or workers would violate natural laws. Basically, you need to let companies and people fail in order to make sure the strongest products are being produced and the strongest economy exists. And on our right, we have an example that I've been using for a few years now, right? iPhone versus BlackBerry. And we don't even have the discussion of iPhone versus BlackBerry anymore. Now we have the discussion iPhone versus Samsung, right? Or Apple versus Samsung. But back in the day, it was Apple versus BlackBerry. And, there was those who had their iPhone and there was those who had their BlackBerry. And there was no clear indicator in the beginning who would be the successful one. But as time passed, the iPhone continued to get stronger and stronger. They added new features. They added more speed, a better selection of apps, all this stuff. And BlackBerry just did not keep up with them in any way, shape, or form. So as time progressed, more people continued to buy more people continued to buy iPhones, and less people were buying Blackberries. And by within 2-3 years, BlackBerry had almost gone out of business where Apple had become the strongest phone company in the world. And that is social Darwinism at its finest, right? One company is expanding, thriving, getting better, and the company that can't keep up is quote unquote dying. And, I wouldn't be surprised if in a few years we saw the end of BlackBerry. All right. We will then take some of your questions and our check for understanding. Social Darwinism promoted the idea that A. New immigrants were equal to native born Americans, B. Stronger businesses would succeed at the expense of weaker businesses, C. The poor should be protected by government action, or D. Natural selection is contrary to demographic principles. And we will go over the answer tomorrow in class. Have a good night.